I would like to summarize a few topics that go kind of into the agricultural business model that kind of dominates our societies in the modern world. And I want to start out by looking at this file where it says ag input costs squeeze producers. At the moment I'm filming this, it's down at the bottom. It may not eventually be right there, but it's a PowerPoint. So if you just click on that, you'll get to um, that file, and it's got two parts I want to have you look at. One of them is this slide that shows Canadian gross farm income and net revenue 1926 through 2016. This graph shows data from Canada. The story of Canada and the US is pretty similar, but I was not able to find this exact graph for the US. Note that net revenue, an approximation of profits, falls over time. So if you look at this graph, at the top is the gross income. So that's every dollar that comes in for a farmer. Well, that looks pretty good, right? Wow. I mean, this is adjusted for inflation. And by golly, wow, it's up, fivefold or more. What's not to like about that? But that's gross. The net revenue, that's what you get after all the bills are paid, is not so shiny. In fact, in adjusting for inflation, it's actually down over what it was much of the past century, except for during the Great Depression and some times of high oil prices, which were here in the 80s. Now, I should say this again is a U.S. not a U.S. graph, but it's similar to our story, and it was easy to find. I did try to find one for the U.S., but was not able to do that. So this is for Canada. By the way, just the source here. I'm just kind of showing you that too. So that's the first part, and then the second slide shows a oops. Let me go back here. Here we go. So crop prices were upper left here. Crop prices fall as per acre yields rise. So if you just look, for example, at this graph, it shows wheat, soybeans, corn. Those are the major agricultural commodities of the United States and Canada and Australia and other areas. So these are the basic grains. This is field crop farming, if you want to call it that, the basic grains, plus soy. And so what we get here, this is inflation adjusted, is the prices used to be really, really high. They just keep going down and down and down for farmers. Why? Because now they produce so much. In one sense, it's an incredible success story. On the other hand, it's been a real squeeze on farmers, and it's pushed them into, ironically or paradoxically, unsustainable farming techniques and methods. So going back here, farmers produced more per acre while using more and more purchased agrochemicals and reduced labor costs through mechanization. Thus, farm and animal labor from within the farm was replaced with inputs and machinery from off the farm. Crop rotation, manuring, both from animals and also what we call green manuring, which you might have read already about in that chapter called green manuring, and also crop diversity was replaced by fertilizer use. So a lot of the benefits of these, including adding some nitrogen in from nitrogen fixation, for example, humus, plant, soil carbon, and so on. All of this was for the most part replaced by fertilizer use. There's still some crop rotation, but nothing like we used to see. Even when I was very young, I remember a lot more of that. It was kind of going out when I was aware of it here in the late 60s and 70s, if you go back and look at the graph there. Well, one result was falling profits. Much of field crop farmer income has come from government subsidies. I'm over here in the middle left, okay? Yeah, let me repeat that. Much of field crop farmer income has come from government subsidies. I gave you a similar statistic in an earlier YouTube. I remember as a farmer myself, the first 10 years of my adult life, a saying in the community, behind every successful farmer is a wife that works in town. So government subsidies and off-farm income of 90% of the household income of farming families. So that's a failed model. If you look at it from the point of view of a farmer, because most of them simply couldn't make it without government handouts. We're talking about field crops now, okay? Or putting money in from some other job that they have off the farm because the farm isn't cutting it. And so that's kind of sad if you think about it. And going down a little more on this, another result from the heavy pesticide and fertilizer use, together with heavy tillage, is declining soil carbon. So this is the subject of much of the Montgomery and Bickle book. Okay, so as you read that, if you have, you're getting a good sense of what I'm talking about. Okay, so this is the first slide, and what I want to do is we'll go now to the next one, which is the system that we're in. So we basically went into a very heavy input system with purchased inputs, more market oriented in terms of where you get things rather than producing what you need on the farm itself, which also means increasing debt in many cases. Here, let's look at the capitalism, dependency, and resource problem slide then. Right here it is. Okay. Capitalism, the agrochemical supply industry, farm profitability, and dependency. So within the broader capitalist system that we live in, the motive force is profit. On the other hand, nature's resources and services are free. So the problem of externalities is where costs are not borne by those outside of market transitions or transactions. They're not generally built into the market. So this is an example. The huge amount of fertilizer effluent that comes off the farms in the Great Plains runs down the rivers into the Mississippi River, dumps out into the Gulf, and causes tens of millions of damage to the fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico. That's an externality. The kind of farming system that still dominates in much of that region is imposing those costs on those fisheries downstream. That would be an externality, okay? So profitability is highest when there is one or a few producers and thus have pricing power to dominate. And so the classic case of this is really the monopolistic kind of setting we have with Monsanto and a few other companies supplying much of the inputs for farming and field crop farming today. And that's a very profitable system for them. And because there's not a lot of competition for them, they have pricing power, okay? On the other hand, farmers supplying the world's food supply, there are millions of farmers, so not just a handful. So they don't have any pricing power at all. A big grain farmer in North Dakota can't just say, I'm going to hold my wheat off the market and we're going to cause the price to go up. Doesn't work that way. So they're squeezed. They're squeezed by having only a few input suppliers that are of major importance. And they're also squeezed on the other end because most of the world's grain trade comes from just 5 corporations that buy the grain. And so they have some pricing power as well. Although it's generally what they call market-based. They do have pricing power because there's not really much competition on either end of that for farmers. So what this model does is it leads to growth in the agricultural inputs industry, with most of farm revenue over time going to inputs purchased off the farm rather than to the farmer. And we already saw that graph. It was the Canadian graph that gives you a sense of that happening over time. This chemically intensive model has degraded soils, as we've seen in Montgomery and Bickle, water, the atmosphere with more carbon emissions. One of the major sources of carbon emissions in the world is fertilizer manufacturing using fossil fuels, for example. It's also running tractors around. It's pumping water out of aquifers. There's lots of things that go into farm inputs that are carbon emissions, but fertilizers are the single largest one because they're made as an energy intensive process. rather than generated on the farm. As we were learning in the readings, that's possible to do. And also, it's degraded the related biota, all being externalities. So the loss of a lot of the wildlife in the regions where we have this kind of fence to fence kind of farming as we have in much of the Midwest, for example, creating yet more chemical input dependency and expenses for farmers. So the model has degraded our environment, and it's made farmers more dependent on this industry. What's going on? Why does it work this way? Some of it is the politically powerful agro industry sets the agenda for government-sponsored research. They have a huge team of lobbyists just across from the nation's capital, and they go on there and they're forever lobbying on this kind of stuff. They're very powerful. So that exacerbates the dependency on their inputs. It's no question that that's in their interest to lobby, and they've been doing it for decades. They're very, very effective. They have many professional lobbyists. And even some major political folks like the Bush family and the Clinton family, either political party, have sat on boards, for example, on some of these giant corporations. Why do you think they're asked to sit on boards? It's all about influence, okay? So the paradox here is that nature's services can almost completely provide the same services as the agrochemical industry provides, and few to no externalities, okay? So we don't really need to have this degraded soils, water, atmosphere, and biota, but we do because of the nature of our system, all right? So now let's go to one other link in the Moodle system. It's the agrochemicals provide file. And let me find it. Let's just go right back to, here we are. There we go, right there. So now we're going to look at this one. Agrochemicals provide these services, but so does nature. Okay. Something to think about. This is really, in some ways, kind of a big summary of a lot of what we've been doing in this unit. Agrochemicals provide these services, but so does nature. What's the difference? Okay. So this should help you get a big picture of what we've been trying to do in this unit. Agrochemicals provide insect control, fungus control, weed control. Fertilizers give us macronutrients and even micronutrients that we can feed to the crops, okay? But nature provides all of these services too, and has done so since long before humans were even on this planet. Recent science on photosynthesis-driven restorative agriculture is showing us how soil biology provides all these services and more. What's the difference? The difference is nature is free. The carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen atoms that make up at least 95% of plant biomass in the world, it's a little more than that, all come from the atmosphere and water. The rest, including phosphorus and potassium and the other nutrients, come from the soil. The microbiology of a healthy soil, one that develops only with a continuous and diverse cover of photosynthesizing plants, liberates some of these minerals and otherwise biologically unavailable compounds. And the mycorrhizal fungi that thrive only in an uncultivated, unfertilized, and fungus-free soil are able to pass on scarce nutrients through their vast networks that cover acres of land, okay? So in a sense, this is kind of a big summary of some of your reading, really, kind of putting it into a bit of a nutshell. Science is only now revealing the causal mechanisms that explain the wondrous partnership of photosynthesis, biology, and geology that we call soil. And one thing is emerging for the farmers who are using nature to provide the needed services to their crops. They are still getting high yields, but with much lower expenditures. And again, I'm going to put a little video up, parts of a video, to have you see how that works. It's kind of amazing. Harnessing nature to grow our food produces a better bottom line. They